honored to have with us not only a very good American diplomat, but a very good writer. I discovered Dante Paradiso has written a new book. It's called The Embassy. And I have read it. It is written, it's almost Conradian. It reminds me of James Conrad in some of the writing in establishing the mood of a country that's racked by violence and terror. It's kind of like the heart of darkness, if any of you all have ever been assigned to read that. He does a great job of establishing the setting for this book, which we'll talk about. But just a little bit more about our guest. I discovered last night that Dante grew up with Mark Lerner of our history department, who's here, and that's how we came to get him here. They grew up in the Bronx. Dante went to Yale. He has had an interesting career. Before he went to law school, he was in the Peace Corps, and that was his first experience in Africa. And where was it?
In Kenya.
In Kenya, okay. He's on the east coast of Africa. He returned as an intern in law school to have an internship at a neighboring state in Tanzania. And he was there in the embassy, actually in the building, when it was bombed. It's one of the first acts of terror directed at the U.S. by Al-Qaeda in 1998. And simultaneously they bombed the embassy in Dar es Salaam, where Dante was, but then they also bombed the embassy in Nairobi in Kenya. Undeterred by all of this, he decided to become a diplomat. He has served in a number of interesting and dangerous places. He's kind of specialized in Africa, but he had years in Beijing, and he is back in the Far East in a position with I guess it would be the consulate in Hong Kong. Yeah. So, but he's had an interesting career in Africa, and most importantly, for our purposes this morning, he's going to talk about the experiences in Liberia, and that's what the book is all about. It's a book about not only American efforts to bring some peace to a terrible civil war that was going on in Liberia, but also the role of the international journalistic community in Monrovia during this period. Why don't we start off, if you could establish, probably there are a lot of people here who don't know why the U.S. has a special stake in Liberia.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Curtis, and thank you to the audience for coming out early on a Friday. It's pretty impressive. Students should give themselves a pat on the back for getting up. We'll try to give them a good story. But the United States essentially founded Liberia back in the 1820s. And so while the country, the Republic of Liberia, was established in 1847, it was essentially funded by the U.S. Congress to send African Americans back to Africa. And it was an interesting experiment in how to do things, but there were already folks living there. And so as a result, there were tensions at the creation of the state right from the beginning. And those tensions in the early 80s kind of broke out. And by the mid-90s, Liberia had found itself in a really bad civil war that was characterized by factional fighting. A lot of different groups fighting for territory and control of the capital. And it led to some pretty horrific abuses of the Liberian people and the population. And the frame of this particular book is the inflection point in 2003 when after many years of stop-and-start civil war, Liberia was sort of on the precipice of whether it was going to dissolve as a state and break down into factional fighting, from which there probably would be no return, along the lines of what we've seen for many years in Somalia, or whether they were going to get onto a rough path of stability. And they had a leader, Charles Taylor, who had been implicated in horrific crimes, some of the worst kind of crimes that you can imagine, in neighboring states, in Liberia, but also in neighboring states like Sierra Leone, where he was implicated in support for the Revolutionary United Front, a rebel group that was known for, hacking off the arms of children. And they would hack off your arm up here, they would call it a short sleeve. If they took you at the wrist, they would call it long sleeve, because that's what it would look like. And they'd throw the arms in a pile and walk away. So a court was established to try to get Charles Taylor, or to hold him responsible for these crimes in a neighboring country. And at the same time, he started to lose a war against two rebel armies that were fighting to depose him.
In Liberia.
In Liberia. And neither of these rebel armies had a governing mandate. So the period we describe in the book, which was a period that I was on the ground, there were two rebel armies and Charles Taylor's government. And they were converging on the capital. And the Liberian people were really suffering. There were about 3 million Liberians at the time. More than 1.5 million of them either lived outside the country or were internally displaced people, so driven out of their homes, living in camps. And those camps, particularly for the IDPs, collapsed in on the city. And from the years of the Civil War, the city had no electricity, no running water, no resources. And all of a sudden you had an extra couple 100,000 people in the city. And the rebels were coming. And a peace process was hastily formed in Accra, Ghana, a nearby country. And Charles Taylor flew to the peace process. It was widely believed that he would use it as a stalling tactic to prevent the rebels from getting too far and kind of give his troops a chance to reorganize. But on the opening of the conference, this court unsealed an indictment for Charles Taylor. And back in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, everybody thought that the head of state had been arrested and he wouldn't be coming back. And so they started running, everybody started running. And it created chaos because people thought, well, we suddenly don't have a head of state, so who's going to control all of Charles Taylor's fighters? And in fact, they went around and started executing people.
Let me stop here and tell us just a little bit more about Charles Taylor and his American background, because this is not somebody that kind of sprung out of Liberia.
Well, Taylor had an interesting history. He had a mixed background, so he was part Americo-Liberian. So these are some of the original, a descendant of the original American settlers into Liberia. But at the same time, he had a mixed heritage, so he also had some indigenous background. Made him an interesting character, but he had some money in his family in Liberia, and so he grew up at the same schools that other reasonably well-off Liberians went to. He ended up going to college in Massachusetts for a time. I don't think he graduated. And then he returned to Liberia in the mid-'80s and was working in the government, and they tried to convict him of some corruption charges. So he fled to Massachusetts and found himself jailed pending a extradition, and somehow escaped jail and returned to Liberia and started a insurrection.
I remember when I was working for the Boston Globe, he was a good local angle story, as we called it.
Yeah. So he started this insurrection that ultimately led to him forcing an election. And in that election, One of the campaign slogans was, "You killed my ma, you killed my pa, I'll vote for you." So there were, right from the beginning, he was choosing to take on a warlord persona.
Nice guy.
Yeah, he was a difficult character, let's put it that way, but very charismatic.
Yeah.
Very, very charismatic.
So often these people are charismatic.
Yeah.
So you've got this situation in Monrovia. You're a political officer at the embassy. You've described it. You've got the two rebel groups who want to overthrow Charles Taylor's government, which is pretty fragile anyway. They've descended upon Monrovia, fought their way through, and then you've got Charles Taylor's people and his army trying to hold on. So you've got a pretty terrible situation. The U.S. Embassy is working to try to resolve it, to basically get rid of Charles Taylor and avoid any further bloodshed. Talk about some of the efforts and your difficulties in dealing with three sides, and did the U.S. have any help from other embassies that were in Monrovia, or had they shut down because of all the violence?
Yeah. The U.S. Embassy was essentially the last diplomatic mission left. Most of the other large bilateral missions had left in the 80s. You had a small residual European Union presence of a couple people. You had a UN presence that had to evacuate as the rebels attacked. And essentially what happened in the 3 months that my book narrowly describes, which is June to August 2003, rebels attacked the capital 3 times. And so the question for an embassy, for journalists, for humanitarian workers is, can you stay? The country is very isolated. It's very hard to get in and out. There were hardly any airlines flying, and in fact there was only one airline flying. The other ones had all suspended their service, and that was an unreliable airline. And to get those flights, you were 40 minutes outside of the capital. And whenever the fighting would come, those flights would stop. So you're really isolated, and the question is can you stay open? Can you continue to engage and try to facilitate a diplomatic process? Try to get relief to Liberian people who are suffering there. And that was the challenge that the small international community and Liberian partners on the ground, local NGOs, other people in civil society were facing. How do we bring attention to this? And there was only one answer, which is you need 2 elements, or 3 elements. Charles Taylor had to go at some point because it was a deeply personal war against him. And so the rebels were not going to stop as long as he was in power, and his folks were not going to stop fighting as long as they had his command and control. The second element that you really needed was some sort of way forward on peace. So this Accra process that was going on in Ghana, whereby the different Liberian parties were trying to get a ceasefire and come up with a peace process, had to move forward. There had to be some agreement to stop fighting. And then the third thing is you needed an intervention force of some sort that was looked upon as neutral, that would separate these warring parties that were slaughtering people in the middle of the city. And the ambassador, when he describes this conflict, he says, he really had to manage 3 aspects of the equation. One was dealing with Charles Taylor's government and trying to figure out how to maintain that relationship, even though our objective was to remove Charles Taylor. Second thing was how to deal with the 2 rebel armies and those people. And the third thing was how to deal with Washington. And there was tremendous pressure to close the embassy and say, we're done with Liberia. And you can see why, because if we had miscalculated and the embassy had gotten overrun, either by rebel groups or by Charles Taylor, then you're risking the lives of your personnel on the ground. And it's a tough decision. We were not the direct focal point of attacks, but we were getting hit with the same things that the rebels were, that the population was being hit with. Stray bullets, mortars, RPGs.
And your complex had become a place of refuge for a lot of people.
Yep. We had two complexes. One was a chancery where the embassy proper was located. Another was an adjacent compound. Folks broke into that compound, and they had about 15,000 people just living on a U.S. Facility. The problem was, as a friend of mine said, there was really no place in Monrovia at the time that a mortar could hit and not hit somebody. So people were just getting killed left and right. And that was the situation that we were trying to navigate. I think when you think about the management of a complex crisis, and you guys see on a regular basis, we see in the news embassies under pressure and societies under pressure, and how do you manage that? I think from the ground level, you need several elements, right? You need, one, a strategy and a way forward. The second thing is you need a compelling case for interests. We're often told just to be present is not enough. There has to be a reason you're putting your life on the line. And that reason has to be both based in U.S. interests for U.S. diplomats and also a clear strategy. And the ambassador made a number of those cases to give himself the breathing room to keep the embassy open and try to facilitate a peace process.
Now, diplomatically, you had a channel with the Charles Taylor government, even though you made it very clear that you want Charles Taylor to go. But I want to bring in the journalists here and their role, because it was not so easy to deal with the two rebel groups. And I don't know diplomatically whether you could formally talk to them, but the impression I had was that here you were relying a great deal to reach the rebel groups through the journalists who were there. So could you maybe first of all describe what kind of international journalistic community was there during all the trouble, and then what was the role that they played in, one, getting the story out to the rest of the world, yep, but secondly, enabling the U.S. Embassy to have an understanding of what's going on with these rebel groups that you were not in talks with directly?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, because the media plays a critical role in the resolution of any international crisis by focusing attention on crises that allow groups of interests to direct resources toward resolving the conflict. Most conflicts have external factors. It's not just two groups of people within a country fighting and you can seal it off. There's neighboring states, there's arms dealers, there's financiers of conflict around the world. And so therefore, there's a whole bunch of other actors in the, broadly speaking, the international community that have an equity in resolving conflict. But in order for consensus to be reached, whereby a country like the United States or other countries decide to expend money, put personnel at risk, to try to resolve a conflict in somebody else's country and culture, you need to have really compelling reasons. And the press plays a key role in showing the world what those reasons might be. And it can be something as simple as not allowing a humanitarian catastrophe, but it can also be looking at the effects of a country and showing that if Liberia goes, the region goes. We only have to look at the Ebola crisis and say, well, here's a case where if Liberia had not become had not stabilized and was not a stable partner, how would you have gotten that under wraps? Who would you have partnered with to try to actually contain a serious health crisis? And this can go for terrorism and other things. So, what role specifically can the press play? The first thing in Liberia was, Liberia being as isolated as it was for many years, it was out of the headlines. It was just out of the headlines. And the period that this story happened and occurred was 2003, in the middle of 2003. So the United States had just invaded Iraq. And at the time, it was the almost sole focus of the U.S. government was telling that story. And all the press, and Curtis, you know, you've been a member of the press for many years working these kind of stories. Everybody was in Iraq. They were not in most other places of the world. Of course, they have bureaus around and things, but the bulk of foreign correspondents' attention was on what was happening there. So for Liberia, there were 3 waves of rebel attacks, and in the first wave, there were a couple journalists on the ground. BBC was there, the AP was there, and they mostly left after that wave, and Liberia sort of vanished. And a couple of them actually were told by their headquarters to evacuate. So you didn't have much of a presence. But a second attack came coincident with President Bush's visit to the continent. And his visit to the continent created a lot of interest. And as a result, the #1 question, even though he had gone to talk about AIDS relief and some other major White House initiatives, the question on everybody's mind is, well, what are you going to do about Liberia, since this is a country that the United States has a unique relationship with based on its history? And a lot of press descended on Liberia. Now, this is pre-social media. So you're dealing with press outlets, media outlets. You're not dealing with bloggers. You're not dealing with individuals and not a lot of freelancers. You're dealing with Agence France-Presse, the New York Times, Fox News, you know, sort of leading outlets for the media. But it was, you know, 40-plus journalists, television crews. They all descended for this narrow time to pose the question, since the United States has a unique relationship, what are you going to do? So the first thing they did is, that's the composition of the people that were there, and they were asking the question and showing the world there's a tremendous crisis here. The United States is implicated, whether it would like to be or not, and so what's the answer? The second thing they did is, the nature of the conflict, after a couple raids, the rebels finally took half the city. And we at the embassy knew that at some point we're going to have to talk to the rebels, and we didn't really know how we were going to be able to do that. We could talk to their leadership, which was at the peace conference, but the commanders on the ground that are fighting and killing people and controlling the weapons and controlling the city are a little bit beyond our reach. So the question is, how do you get to them? How do you reach a rebel force? And there came a point where the front lines sort of softened, and the press said, we're going to cross through the front lines. Now, humanitarian workers were also doing this simply because that's what humanitarian workers do, is they wave a flag and they walk across the front lines and they try to get both sides not to shoot at them. So the press sort of sensed, okay, there was a rough stasis as people were waiting to see, would Charles Taylor collapse? Would there be an intervention force? Would there be some movement at the peace process? They were fighting, they were shooting, they were killing people, but neither side was advancing. So the press took the opportunity, some courageous journalists, some would say a little bit crazy, negotiated their way across the front lines and got the story about the rebels and tried to learn about the rebel side. And quoted in the book is my friend Emmanuel Goujon, who said, you know, normally in a war you don't actually, one person doesn't cover both sides. Both sides are covered, but one person doesn't do it. And he related a story when he was in the Congo in a similar situation. He was traveling with rebels outside the capital, and then he tried to come into the capital. And they threatened him, and he said to me, well, they told me, we're going to cut your hands, we're going to cut your balls, we might kill you. He said, well, all of it was a kind of suffering, right? A lot of options, but all of it was a kind of suffering. And that was kind of what these guys were facing. But they managed to do it. And once they managed to do it, they showed us it was possible. So they opened the door for us. And the third thing is that there's always informal exchanges of information in conflict between humanitarian workers, journalists, diplomats, people on the ground, people in IDP camps. And the reason you do this is you're trying to look out for your own personal safety. Where is the fighting taking place? Can you get through that checkpoint? Can we reach somebody at this location? But one of the things we did in our informal exchanges is that we ended up with the rebels' phone numbers. And that allowed us to start to contact the actual field commanders, which allowed us to then ourselves, under the ambassador's leadership, go across the front lines and try to negotiate the rebels to leave the city.
Dante and I had dinner last night with Mark, and we talked about this relationship between diplomats and journalists, because if you're a journalist and we call it parachuting into a situation like this, that you're maybe not ordinarily based there, your knowledge is limited, you're looking for who can you talk to. And in the cases I remember, not in Liberia for this, but you go to the NGOs, the non-government organizations, like Catholic Relief Services, who are there and they're working humanitarian projects, and they know a great deal. They're great sources, but also the diplomats. And it is a kind of, it's not really a game, but it's a situation where we're trying to pick the brains of the diplomats who know a great deal, and they're formally based there. And at the same time, they are picking our brains because perhaps we have talked to rebels, we've talked to people that they're not talking to, and so it's kind of a transfer of back and forth information, and that would have gone on there in Monrovia with a number of people that you describe in the book.
Right, for sure, yeah.
One of the things that, distinguished is probably not the right word, but it was distinctive of that conflict was the kids and the dress that some of the fighters had. To talk just a little bit, it's almost unimaginable, but these young kids with AK-47s and wedding gowns that they think are going to protect them.
Yeah. Liberia was a predominantly Christian country. The folks coming down were part of a Muslim community that lived for a long time in the border, but there was also this big animist tradition in Liberia, which is sort of indigenous local religions that had some different practices that we're not used to in the West. And when the fighting came in, they sort of adopted elements of all of these things, and they had a lot of superstition that, for example, if you painted yourself a certain way, or you wore a certain type of outlandish dress, perhaps the bullets would miss you. They had one General Butt Naked, who just fought naked because he said that would give him strength and the bullets would just go right by him, and he actually was not killed. They would take on interesting nom de guerre. So they would take on interesting personas. I tell a story of a journalist who met a general, self-proclaimed general, Cairo Pupu. And he said, well, okay, what's the Cairo? And the guy said, well, the city. And he said, well, the Pupu? He said, well, it's something about, I don't know, the smell doesn't stick to you, or it sticks to you, or, so, you just have these kind of interesting personas. The conflict was marked by widespread use of child soldiers, so they were taking very young children and arming them. I asked the vice president at one point in Liberia, why did you do this? And he said, because children are easy to control. So it was just a mentality that this was the way you could fight. But as a result, you had horribly undisciplined fighters that didn't really know what they were doing. They were often pumped up on drugs, and they would be running out with AK-47s and spraying like that, or just shooting rocket-propelled grenades. And the horrible aspect of that is they weren't really hitting each other most of the time. They were just hitting civilians. And so people were just dying left and right. And so the Liberian population was under tremendous strain. That's sort of the nature of the conflict. But you would see these images coming out of it from the photographers of young men fighting in wedding dresses and taking body parts and putting them on their bodies as necklaces and things like that. And it sort of reinforced that this was a horrific war. The one thing I would caution, Curtis, is that we shouldn't look at this as unique to Africa or unique to any particular part of the world. War is just horrific, and we see this in the Middle East today with some of the things that ISIS is doing, just things that are really unimaginable in societies that are stable and peaceful. And then the depravities come out once people start wholesale killing each other.
Yeah, certainly instances of that in Asia,
Yep.
Indonesia, I think of. You were under pressure, you being the American embassy from Washington, to basically let's close it down. Talk about that process. I know the ambassador was talking to the Secretary of State Powell at the time, Colin Powell, and he never demanded that you shut the embassy down, but he's giving strong hints that perhaps the time had come to close the embassy and get out of there. By that time, they had dispatched some forces at sea so that there could be a rescue mission. But talk about that kind of embassy crisis, whether you stay and try to help the peace process, or you give it up and save your people, get them offshore.
Yeah. Well, the ambassador was under heavy pressure because we had a split in the cabinet between the Office of Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. Now, there were other members of the cabinet lining up on different sides, but I would say the predominant sentiment was it's time to pull the embassy out of Liberia. Now, since we were the last diplomatic platform, the international community would not have had a way to, or a vector by which they could go in and try to help the Liberians and partner with Liberians on the ground end the conflict had we left. So the ambassador was under tremendous pressure because he had powerful figures in Washington saying, we're out. And here's the thing when you're making these calculations. I've already talked about the things that go into why you would stay, why you would put something at risk in terms of making sure that you have a strategy, making sure that there's a justification for doing it. But there are other things at stake. For example, if you leave, you're also sentencing a lot of local staff. Embassies around the world rely on local staff members from the country to sustain us, keep the generators on, provide us with information, protect us. And all of those folks could have been subject to essentially massacres. A good friend of mine, Jenkins Vengen, was a local Liberian who was in our political shop. And he was under constant threat, and his family was under constant threat because he was seen as essentially working for us, which he was, but he was doing it in a very overt manner. But it was always a threat that, well, you're working with the Americans, and if we think the Americans are against us, we're going to come after you. So for the ambassador, he's looking at, in this particular case, the lives of the local staff, the ability to ever get back in once you leave. Sometimes once you leave, and you know this, when we left Afghanistan, we didn't go back for many, many, many years. And so if you pull that presence out, you just may not be there, which means you don't have any way of advancing what U.S. interests might be. And so he had to make several compelling cases for what our interest in staying were. One was prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. Another was that you leave ungoverned spaces and you have consequences that you don't know. It can be pandemics. It can be terrorist groups using these spaces to destabilize the region and go further abroad. And it can be just creating greater instability in a region that you may have other partners, so destabilizing neighboring countries. And all of those reasons are reasons that he felt it was important for us to stay. And then, of course, our unique relationship with the Liberian people, which a lot of people may not be aware of, but Liberians take very seriously and those who follow Africa, he felt strongly that had we pulled out of a country that we were most closely associated with in Africa, our ability to partner with African countries on things that matter to us and a whole host of areas would have been compromised. So those were all reasons, but you had this pressure coming, understandably, that, you know, 2 rebel armies in Charles Taylor, so that's not a good space for us to be in. And there had to be a sort of way forward. And so if you close the mission, nobody's ever going to blame you for not having saved American lives. But if you keep the mission open and American diplomats or Marines get killed, the last element is that we did have to calculate on a minute-to-minute by basis our security posture. So real heroes in keeping an embassy open are Marine security guards that protect missions, but there are only a few of them. And then you also had local guards from, they were contract local guards, but these are Liberians who were standing up to protect the embassy because they knew if the embassy left as the last platform for international diplomacy, perhaps the whole thing goes up in flames. And they were unarmed, and they stood their ground through horrific fighting. So all of these elements come into the decision of whether you stay or go. Do you have the right security posture? What is the nature of the rebels? What is the nature of your relationship with the Taylor government?
And we all know what happened in Benghazi, so it's not inconceivable. You get overrun and an ambassador dies.
Yeah, I mean, these are the real risks, right? And you know, obviously my heart goes out to my colleagues who, you know, and the families because they lost loved ones in Benghazi. But those are the difficult choices you have to make. And the only way you can make those choices is to sort of be on the ground and have real-time knowledge as to what's going on. And if you don't have that and you go dark, it's pretty hard to tell what's happening.
We're kind of working toward the climax, but we have a little bit of time left. I wonder if anybody in the audience has a question. I'd be happy to take it here, but before I get Dante to describe how all this ends. Does anybody have a question way up in the back?
Yeah, so you kind of talked about Syria a little bit, and everything you're saying about the civil war back in 2003 in Liberia is reminding me a lot of what's happening today over there. So do you see any parallels between the two?
Well, here's what I can say. You know, obviously I'm not working the Syria problem, but when you're thinking about management of a complex crisis, there are elements that need to fall into place for wars to end. Wars do end. All wars end, but they end in messy and unexpected ways. So what are the elements that need to fall into place in a complex international crisis? The first thing is you do need top-level diplomacy. You need consensus and agreement between the large actors that finance and protect states in war. And in a complex crisis like Syria, of course, you're dealing with big countries with big interests, like Iran, Russia, other countries in the region. The second thing you need is sustained attention to the problem, and that comes through, you know, the courageous efforts of media, of humanitarian workers on the ground. You need a compelling sense of who you can partner with. And so that's probably the hardest piece, is understanding all the different actors on the ground in a complex crisis, understanding what their leverage is, and then you need and what their objectives are, and to try to figure out which constellation can come together that can build a consensus toward ending the conflict on the ground. And then the last thing you need is you need some sort of facilitative process. And that can happen at the high level at the Security Council in a complex case like Syria, but it can also happen at a sub-regional level. So in Liberia, you also had entities like ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and other entities like that. All of these things need to come into play. And then the final piece is that the people that are involved in the conflict at some level are going to have to make decisions to stop shooting. And that can be done with sustained pressure from the outside, but it also has to, is a calculus that they are making on a day-to-day and minute-by-minute about how long they themselves as rebel organizations, as rump governments, can sustain fighting. It is difficult to sustain high-intensity fighting over long, long periods of time, which is why there can be lulls. And what's needed is when the lulls happen, is you got to seize the moment, and communities of interest have to coalesce in that time. And it's very hard to do in complex crises. But in Liberia, they had in the 90s, they had 13 peace agreements, and they just kept returning to fighting. So you could have looked at it as hopeless. And this was a case where the ingredients came together, and I can sort of describe the ending. The ingredients came together where Charles Taylor realized that, the writing was on the wall for him, and he decided to leave. And it's a sort of complex decision that went into that. I won't go into the details too much, but he left, which left his rump forces and the two rebel armies. Now, the rebels' position was, we've won, we should have the spoils, but they didn't have a mandate to govern. They were not supported by the majority of the Liberian people, and therefore, you needed this peace process to come into place. And if a peace accord hadn't been struck and an interpositional force hadn't been inserted in there in a way that allowed the parties to separate, if that moment had been missed, they could very well still be fighting today. So it's finding that right time and having some leadership from certain quarters, and it can vary, but that has to fall into place, and then you can manage a crisis.
What happened to Charles Taylor?
Charles Taylor ended up in exile temporarily in Nigeria for a few years. And then when a new government came into place in Liberia, what happened was they went through a transitional government, and they ended up with an election which elected the first woman president in Africa. And so it was a great symbolic achievement for the Liberian people. And then the new government, asked that he be rendered to a court. He was rendered to the special court, and he ended up being convicted for war crimes. And he's now in jail in England, actually.
Was it The Hague where he was convicted? Yeah. So it was an international process.
Well, and yes, the special court, but it was conducted overseas. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've got one more question.
Yeah,
got a couple of minutes.
Well, I noticed that when you talk about U.S. interests, these are largely multinational corporations, usually get the first interest. I'm still waiting for the American press to talk about the oil in Somalia, because the American media makes them think we're in Somalia because we care about starving children, when what we really care about is oil. And I don't know exactly, Liberia was a big rubber. Of course, next door was diamonds, coltan, which is absolutely vital for cell phones. So most of these people are actually getting killed by corporations and governments who are interested in the resource wars. But actually what I wanted to ask you about was this one particular economic interest, which was Pat Robertson, Reverend Pat Robertson, who had a gold mine deal with Charles Taylor. Yep. And I just wondered if you run into, if you can talk a little bit about Reverend Pat.
Well, I won't go into specifics of particular corporations or particular individuals, but what I will say is that the connection between resource extraction and war is something that is a real connection. That a lot of states that are wholly reliant on resource extraction and then don't properly disseminate the wealth to the population and don't create systems of responsive governance do run into serious conflicts and serious trouble. I will also say that U.S. interests include a panoply of things that very much include business interests. That is certainly part of something that our government will represent, because it represents jobs, energy, and a whole host of other things that are important for how our country works. With that said, we also quite often stand up and do the right thing. And so in this particular case, the galvanizing piece in Liberia was the humanitarian crisis, a broad humanitarian crisis that attracted the attention, because by the time in 2003 that this conflict was really hot, most of the companies that had been in Liberia for many, many years doing resource extraction, and they were joint ventures and they were partnered with the state for rubber, as you mentioned, or for iron ore, another big resource over there, they were long gone. So you were not dealing with protection of particular interests there. Those interests were long gone. But what you were dealing with is, a whole host of NGOs that do have lines into Washington. So for a complex crisis to be resolved, actually a lot of these voices come into play. It's not just a straight corporate interest. It's actually humanitarian interests, people who care. Those things affect Washington policymaking. They may be less so in other countries, but we still have a strong human rights bent in our foreign policy, and we still have large constituencies in the United States that advocate for humanitarian relief. So those are all elements in resolving a conflict.
We are out of time. Dante, thank you so much. It's been a terrific program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Curtis, and thank you to all of you guys for coming out on a beautiful Friday morning. Much appreciate it.